Now, the title of this conference is, as you know, Resilience at Risk. But what are these risks, and what can be done to mitigate them? We see a domino effect of disruption all around us, impacting our daily lives, from the conflict in Ukraine and the continuing impact of COVID, to the cost of living crisis and fears of a global recession. Well, today we are joined by experts from 3 companies which help businesses gain insight and find supply chain resilience solutions to these types of challenges. Please welcome on stage Steve Baycott of Risk Intelligence, Mirko Wojcik of Everstream Analytics, and Joe Ryan of Overhaul. Gentlemen, welcome to you all, and thank you so much for joining us. Let's get started. As you know, I'm going to ask you all to give us your presentations, and after we've heard all 3, if we've still got some time, we'll have a couple of questions. So, Steve, you're our first speaker, followed by Mirko and then Joe. Steve, over to you. Thank you all.
Thanks very much, Sam, and thanks very much to Tapper for the opportunity to speak to you all today. I'm sure you can all hear me, but you may not be able to see me. I should have brought my orange box today to stand on. But we've got a short presentation today. So in this short brief, I want to just give you a brief overview of some of the various threats posed on a typical European logistics route. Because it isn't just cargo theft that should be keeping us up at night. We're going to use a case study route and look at a variety of threats and how you can use intelligence together with your route planning to try and mitigate these threats and make best use of your available security resources. And it's an overview only, so I'll be whistling through, but do come and see us at our stand anytime during the conference if you want to discuss any further. So let's just dive straight in. So our case study route for today is from Madrid, Spain to Manchester, UK. It's around 2,000 kilometres. And along this route, within about a 25-kilometre radius, we've got 330-odd parking areas. And this includes non-secure services and rest areas and a small number of secure parking areas. Also, we've identified along this route, we've had about 300 incidents in the last 6 months within that 25-kilometre radius. And although some threats are present along the entire route, we've identified a number of high-risk areas and also some hotspots, which we'll take a look at a little bit later. And also the incident sources for today from Tapper. We have our incident sources from Tapper, and also those sources we have from our own sources and open sources. So, if we just break down into the main threats we have along the route itself, cargo theft, it's no surprises, it's why we're all here, but particularly in the areas of Paris, London, Milton Keynes, and the Manchester areas. We also have the threat of violent activism and protests, particularly in Spain, when we look back over the last 6 months, but also, and then more recently, in London and in the southeast of the UK. Fuel siphoning, it's happening basically everywhere. Then also we've got the threat of migrants actually boarding your trucks at the bottleneck in this route in the area of the Channel ports. And finally, when we get to the end of the route around Manchester, we've got an increased threat of last-mile delivery thefts, but also robberies, which are obviously of concern. And the majority of these threats are all compounded, by the lack of secure parking along much of the route, which obviously we're all very much aware of. So when we break down our incidents along the route, there's no big surprises here. Cargo theft is the most prevalent threat, highlighted in red in the left-hand side of the screen. And we've recorded over 130-odd thefts from trucks and trailers. But also of concern is a number of robberies. Of course, there's a high threat to the driver. It involves some form of confrontation. We've had activism protest incidents and also the thefts of entire delivery vehicles. And these were mainly last-mile delivery thefts. And we'll take a look at some of these big numbers as we go through the presentation. So, of course, the threat of cargo theft is prevalent along the entire route. But there are some high-risk areas, as we said, around Paris, London, Vermars, Milton Keynes and Manchester. And along the route itself, within a 25-kilometre radius, we've had recorded 30 incidents taking place at the parking areas themselves, and the remainder along in close proximity to the route in industrial parks, other public roads, and other non-dedicated parking areas, just where trucks end up parking for the night. And that's what we know about. We only actually provide, the instance that we have enough sufficient data and accurate data so we can give you actionable intelligence. So always try and give you the when, where, and what happened, just so you can build up your situational awareness of what is going on along your route. But we know we don't have the full picture. So, I know everyone else in the room is well versed in the threat of cargo theft. It's while we're here, many of us here will have experienced it. But just these 4 examples we have on the screen now just highlight the capability and the intent of the criminals that are operating on this route and the risk posed to drivers in violent confrontations. So, as we can see on the left-hand incident, there's 60 TVs stolen from a load. Now, this takes a well-oiled and slick cargo theft gang. It takes resources, lookouts, surveillance teams. It takes a smooth operation to steal these loads. And, this is typical of many of the organised crime gangs that we see on many other routes. Also, if we take the right-hand incident, as we can see, they're very confident. They've targeted 5 trucks in a single incident. As we know, they'll do this often, and they'll just slash the peepholes and take the goods that they're looking for. But the ones of equal concern are the 2 robbery incidents in the centre. And as we saw in one of these robbery incidents, the driver was actually forced to stop at gunpoint while at transit. And even though they weren't successful in this incident, obviously this is a traumatic event for the driver. And we need to make sure that our drivers are trained and prepared for these kinds of incidents. And also, we have a last-mile delivery courier van robbed. Again, a confrontation with the driver. So it's not just our long-distance transports that are being targeted. So the area of the Channel ports is obviously an obvious bottleneck on our route on the way to Manchester, and I want to take a quick look at this area now. Now, we all know that the clandestine boarding of trucks by migrants is a European-wide threat, particularly in the port areas. And of course, as the port security is boosted in these areas, the migrants are just moving further afield, and they're starting to board trucks on the approaches further afield into the ports. But there's some unique factors at play in Calais, which we'll take a look at now. So, in the area of Calais, we've identified the whole area of the Channel ports, you can see in the grey area, as a high-risk area, with an elevated threat of cargo theft, but also a high threat of migrants boarding trucks or confronting drivers. And we're just focusing on these kind of incidents right now. And we just extended our search range to the last 18 months, just to highlight that this is an ongoing problem. It's been going on for some time, and it's not likely to go away anytime soon. So the number of incidents may not seem excessive, but the potential impact can be high. Now, we've had incidents where the migrants have been killed or injured whilst trying to board the trucks. And of course, this is obviously tragic for the migrant involved, but it's extremely distressing for the driver. And also the police in these instances, there's been a fatality or serious injury, they've got to conduct a comprehensive investigation. So you're going to have increased delays to your shipments. We've also seen isolated instances of drivers injured in altercations with migrants and trucks damaged as they try and navigate their way through pickets of migrants on the approaches to Calais port. But also one area itself, the Transmark industrial area in Calais, is definitely an area to watch. Now, there is secure parking here available, as there is elsewhere in Calais, but part of this threat is actually when the trucks are moving from these secure parking areas to the logistics facilities, where they're having to navigate and drive at low speeds. And this is a time when the migrants will gather, and they'll try and recklessly board the trucks at this vulnerable time. So you may be safe and sound all night in a TAPA accredited secure parking area, but when you leave this site, the drivers must be vigilant. And this is difficult. You're driving at low speeds, often in the hours of darkness. So it is hard for the drivers to spot the migrants, and it is a hard threat for us to combat. So, of course, many threats we face, they're not the same countrywide, they're not the same all the way along the route. And we've identified some localised hotspot areas that have experienced a spike in incidents higher than the average for the local area. And we'll just take a look at 2 hotspots now. So the first one in Vermars in France, just north of Paris and just north of Charles de Gaulle Airport. Now this is an example of a very tactical and localised hotspot where we've seen a spike of incidents in the last 6 months, which is still greater than the average for the wider Paris area, which in itself is still assessed as high threat for cargo theft. But Vermars is a perfect storm. We've got a main transit route, the A1. It's convenient parking if you're coming in or out of Paris. We've got logistics facilities located right next to the motorway, and also 3 parking areas, 2 non-secure rest areas and a parking area that has some security measures in place. But even so, despite this, we're still seeing incidents taking place, even at the more secured facility. And in the last year, we've recorded at least 16 incidences where we can provide you with enough information to try and understand what's going on here. So obviously in this place, criminals will always go back to places where they're successful, and they're displaying a high degree of capability, motivation, and intent to keep targeting this area. It's not all bad news. If you were to travel 40 kilometres further north, you can park for the night securely in a TAPA PSR accredited level 1 site. And we recommend that if you, rather than stop in this area, push north and park safely for the night. But also, we have another cargo theft hotspot in Milton Keynes in the UK. And again, this is an example of a perfect storm and a target-rich environment for the cargo thieves. So Milton Keynes, it's home, in the Milton Keynes area, we have 40 business parks. We have major players that have logistics hubs in the area, and also Milton Keynes itself is a logistical hub. Gives easy access to the Midlands, also to the South East and the UK, and to the Channel ports and onto Europe. And of course, it's set astride the M1 motorway, one of the main north-south arterial routes in the UK. And we've recorded incidents taking place at the non-secure parking areas along the M1, but also a lot more in the industrial parks, where drivers are forced to park up overnight while they wait for just-in-time delivery in the morning, and they get their goods stolen hours before they're due to deliver. Again, there is a TAPA accredited, PSR level 3 accredited site just north of the hotspot area, which we recommend parking in if you must park up for the night, particularly overnight in this area. And then other threats on the route. The threat of activism is ever present. We have climate activists, we've got protest groups protesting against the increased price of fuel, which I totally understand, and also anti-war protesters. Now we have the Ukraine conflict, it's kicked off. And we could argue that the Ukraine conflict has further increased fuel prices and also, galvanised some of the actual climate activists to actually, keep pursuing their fight against the use of fossil fuels, but also the use of Russian energy imports that are actually that were coming in until obviously the sanctions are taking a bigger piece of that pie. But the likelihood of obviously getting caught up in an activism incident is lower than regular cargo theft. Depending on what you're carrying, if you're a fuel transporter in the southeast of England, you've been feeling the heat recently while they've been blockading the terminals. But the impact can be potentially higher if your drivers do find themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time. And an interesting example of this is the recent Spanish transport sector strike. Now, it may be old news now as it took place in late March, early April, but it is an important case. And the key issues for me were its speed of onset, the disruption it caused to the supply chain in Spain, but also the violent nature of some, not all, but some of the protesters. And there's some important lessons to be learned here. The spark that lit the fuse was the high price of fuel. And that price isn't going to come down anytime soon, so further protests are entirely possible. And you could also argue that the protest groups, they did achieve some kind of victory here. You could argue they forced the government to increase their subsidy package to the transport sector. And this won't have gone unnoticed by other activist groups who can also hijack the supply chain, get a lot of disruption, a lot of publicity to further their aims. But arguably the most important threat during this protest was the violent incidents against the hauliers who continued to operate in Spain during this period. And as we can see in the red box by the MOUs, by some of the violent elements of the protests, these were deliberate, planned and violent attacks against truck drivers. There was criminal damage and sabotage of trucks, and often hazardous blockades of transit routes and facilities where truck drivers who were driving at speed were forced to stop in a hazardous manner. And drivers were also threatened and injured in some cases, with rocks being thrown from motorway overpasses into the cabs of trucks. And the Spanish National Police and Civil Guard were forced to mobilise 23,000 officers, and they provided security escorts for 5,000 trucks during this period. And we have to make sure that we're ready. This should happen again elsewhere. Are we ready to deal with this threat? There are also other activists or protest groups that pose a threat to our operations. Looking at these 3 quick examples here, the May Day parade on the left, an obvious impact. It's a violent protest, and if you're caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, you could face damages and possibly even injuries to the driver. And of course, if we're driving liveried trucks, with some of these protests, there's anarchists and other anti-establishment protest groups would like nothing better than to damage a well-known logistics company's truck. But also, let's have a look at the centre incident. And this is an interesting case. This was a case of where the truck driver was trying to nudge his way through a protest line. And actually, the driver was then arrested by the police for traffic offences because he put the protesters at risk. And we can all imagine a reputational impact now of seeing one of your liveried trucks on TV squashing a protester at one of these protest lines. So we have to make sure our drivers are trained and prepared for these kind of incidents. And of course, some of these activist threats, they come around like clockwork. Look at the actual threat on the right-hand side. We've got activists actually clambering on board a truck and cutting the brake lines to the trailer, of course, and gluing themselves to the cab. Now, of course, this is a hazard for the driver himself. If we think back to November last year, Black Friday, we had 13 distribution centres in the UK blockaded by activist groups. And it's coming round again. We can plan for this and use intelligence to mitigate these threats. And also, as I said, fuel protesters, fuel transporters are feeling the heat in the UK right now because the activists have been blockading various fuel terminals, which has forced the government to start enacting legislation so they actually arrest and move these protesters from sites. And of course, there is the secondary impact of this, disruption and delay, so your drivers may not reach their planned secure parking for the night. Fuel siphoning. Okay, we've heard a lot about this. There's definitely, in our opinion, a massive spike in this at the moment due to high fuel prices. We discussed it in recent webinars. Tapper talked about it in the last Vigilant magazine. And yes, the threat has always been there, but we have seen the threat has been compounded by the high price of fuel and also the Ukraine conflict fueling this. But we can see it as an increased threat. And it's just basic supply and demand. It's happening everywhere. We've got low-tech attacks with just guys with a couple of jerry cans and a hose and a manual pump, all the way to high-tech attacks where you've got organised gangs with high-capacity vehicles fitted with tanks and high-capacity pumps so they can siphon hundreds, and if not thousands of litres in a short space of time. And of course, they're targeting trucks, but also targeting facilities where they have this fuel storage. And the threat is likely to remain high for the foreseeable future. But let's not forget insider theft here. I'm feeling the pinch, as you all are, with the increase the cost of living and fuel, and it may increase the temptation for staff to pilfer fuel from their loads, either just to make ends meet or to try and earn a quick buck. And finally, guys, we get to the end of our route in Manchester, UK. Our problems are not over, particularly if you're a last-mile delivery provider. And we've had a significant problem with last-mile delivery thefts and robberies in this area, where the criminals are actually targeting the courier vehicles themselves as they're making these doorstep deliveries. And most of this is taking place on quiet residential streets. And often the perpetrators, they'll find it easier to actually rob or steal. If the driver leaves the vehicle unlocked, they'll run in and steal the vehicle. Or if he's still present, they'll threaten or push him out the way, use violence, so that they can take the vehicle. They know it's being tracked. They'll take it round the corner so they can quickly sift through the parcels and take what they're after before escaping the scene. Now, of course, the threat to the driver is increased in these cases, but also your vehicle is outside of your control for this short period of time. They could run down a pedestrian, have a crash at this time, so this is less than ideal. And of course, it's a hard one to fight. We understand the pressures of same-day, next-day delivery, and of course, the driver has got to get out of the vehicle at some stage. So slam locks, procedures, etc. will help, but this is a threat that can be hard to mitigate. Guys, we're almost out of time here. We know that many of these threats here are compounded by a lack of secure parking. There are options available on this site within 25 kilometres of the route. So if you use intelligence and route planning in advance, you hopefully can stay at a secure site for the night. We've got a TAPA accredited sites and EU SSTPA accredited sites en route. But of course, bad things happen on a normal day, and you may be forced to park at a site that is less secure. So you do need to have that plan B up your sleeve. Guys, just to wrap up, we've talked about the threats. I won't talk any bit more about that. But by using an intelligence-led approach, it can assist you with your route planning, identify hotspots, identify where the incidents are happening in the last 6 months. Also, using secure parking, it's a no-brainer, but have a plan B because there's not enough available. And of course, if you can accredit to TAPA standards, fantastic. But even if not, it's all out there on the website. Implement the standards to the extent you can. TSR to protect your trucks, FSR to protect your facilities from cargo theft, but also fuel siphoning. And use PSR to help guide you in your selection of secure parking that is available. And finally, guys, don't forget to brief and train your drivers on their actions during these more high-impact incidents, the protests where there's confrontation, and also the robberies, so that they're prepared to deal with these traumatic events. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you, Steve. Mirko, do come up and join us. And try not to break the AV equipment. Do you want to stay over there, actually, Steve?
Okay.
And I'll ask you the questions with you all sitting there. Mirko, do come and take the lectern. Thank you very much. And if you could try and be finished by about 3 o'clock, then that would give us time to include a question or two at the end.
Should we do Q&A now? Or?
No. Go ahead with your presentation.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session. I'm extremely happy to be here again and feel honored to have been invited again by Torsten and the whole TAPA team. I want to thank them for the opportunity. Talk about a different angle, or to talk about supply chain risk management from a different angle. But I want to start out by saying how fantastic it is to see everyone. Again, it's not the same virtually, so it's really been a nice opportunity again to get to meet everyone. My name is Mirko Wojcik. I'm directing the global risk monitoring activities at Everstream Analytics. We're a supply chain analytics company that has been incubated within Deutsche Post DHL, has previously been called DHL Resilience 360 before the merger, so some of you may still remember that name, thanks to our long-standing partnership again with TAPA EMEA. In a nutshell, what do? We provide our customers with a holistic supply chain risk management solution to better enable their end-to-end supply chain risk activities, including cargo theft, but many other threats as well, from weather to strikes to security aspects, and give them a competitive advantage basically by being able to react faster once they receive the information. Today I want to talk about how companies can strengthen their global supply chains from a different angle, not so much about cargo security, but really about more the geopolitical setting and what technologies are in place to really uncover some of the things that a lot of our customers are working on. I'd like to start off by setting the scene and take a look at the current geopolitical risk landscape, which has obviously dramatically changed since late February, and take a look at how that has impacted global supply chains in many different sectors. Secondly, I'd like to take a look at the greatest challenge that we've been seeing that companies are facing in the last few years, especially with COVID, but now again with the situation that has been evolving in Eastern Europe, which is supply chain visibility beyond the tier 1 level, or rather the lack thereof. This is really being more and more referred to as the weakest link in supply chains, because the lack of visibility on your lower tier suppliers really exposes you to a lot of unknown risks that you can't really mitigate unless you know. And last but not least, I want to focus on what technologies are out there to overcome this challenge of visibility, and how this increased visibility then can help you make your supply chain more resilient and drive value in the short, medium, and long term. At the last TAPA conference in November, which was still obviously virtual, I had mentioned in my presentation how supply chains had truly been upended ever since COVID obviously started, as we've heard again from the previous speakers, both due to supply, but then also demand shocks. At the time, we said that we expected further delays and roadblocks, but that the path towards global recovery was well underway and would likely come about in Q3, Q4 this year. Obviously, we had no idea, or it was difficult to imagine the tragedy would happen in Ukraine, and that is still ongoing, and the impact that would have not only on Ukraine, but really reverberate across global supply chains that are still, obviously, till this day, as we heard, struggling with the impact of the global pandemic. So what we've seen in terms of the impacts in the short term since February is really unprecedented volatility in global commodity markets, from wheat to edible oils, obviously in the news, but also metals such as nickel. We've seen disruptions to manufacturing operations, not only in Ukraine, but Russia, and how that has spilled over into sort of operations elsewhere, mainly in Europe, halting production in many different industrial sectors. We have witnessed the beginning of export restrictions, especially on food commodities in the last couple of weeks, that have started to impact global food prices. So a lot of speakers have talked about the global fuel price, but obviously the food price is also increasing and at the highest level since 2008. In the next couple of months, so in the medium term, the ongoing conflict in Ukraine could, on the one hand, further increase retaliatory cyber attacks, so that's definitely a risk we're watching, especially on Western companies, potentially even ones critical for infrastructure and networks. In addition to that, harvesting season is coming up in Ukraine, and Ukraine being a major exporter of wheat, the lack of these exports via the Black Sea really has the potential to further increase global prices, and that is important because it's not only the wheat price that are going to be impacted, but there will be a spillover effect across many, many different grains and edible oils. Ukraine also being a major producer of sunflower oil. So you'll maybe ask yourself, like, how is that important to me or for my company? Well, basically because buyers and sort of importers will be looking for alternatives, be that corn, be that rice, be that soybean oil or palm oil. So basically we will see many, many different products being impacted by these increases. In the long term, looking more towards the end of the year, we're expecting at this point 3 major risks that will be associated with the ongoing crisis in Ukraine. First, the conflict could spill over to neighboring countries, such as Moldova, Belarus, which are, in terms of supply chains, also connected to the automotive industry, agrochemical industry, also important for agricultural production. So there could be ongoing and sort of spillover effects there. Secondly, someone had mentioned it earlier before, that by the end of the year, energy will be a big issue, right? There could be a colder winter that we've sort of ended now, and if that winter was to rise early, then Europe could very rapidly deplete natural gas supplies that are currently being stocked up, and that could prices to further skyrocket and potentially trigger energy rationing plans that European governments are currently drawing up. That is interesting and potentially dangerous for energy-intensive industries that are using a lot of natural gas supply. We've heard already governments coming out saying pharmaceutical industries, food-making industries, factories, they're definitely going to be considered essential, but no government has come out to sort of really come up with a list and say, this is how we treat different types of industries, this is who would be prioritized in terms of, if we think about heavy manufacturing, industrial machinery, automotive, or even the chemicals industry. So that's going to be a major risk that we're watching. And third, we anticipate that these higher food prices and also energy prices could then lead to maybe more civil unrest around the world. We've seen this already in Sri Lanka and Peru earlier this year with food-related riots, but also within Europe, actually. We've seen massive protests in March in Albania. So it's even within Europe, when, there could be definitely security issues related to that. Coming back to this in a second. So if the situation in Ukraine has really taught us one thing in terms of supply chain risk management, is that most companies did not know how their supply chains were connected to Ukraine. Ever since January, we've been talking to a lot of customers and companies interested in supply chain risk management, and all of these discussions have really revolved around the subject of how am I going to be impacted? What is the potential for Ukraine and sort of the sanctions in Russia, the sanctions in Ukraine, the export restrictions, how could that impact my supply chain, be it in the automotive, be it in the pharmaceutical, be it in the consumer goods industry? What are the major exports out of Ukraine? What are the major suppliers there? What are the products that companies are relying on? Very few companies had that visibility in the lead up to the war. And these anecdotes really confirm some very interesting and really revealing numbers from a recent McKinsey study in which they surveyed supply chain professionals and tried to shed some light on a few topics. One is, where are most supply chain disruptions really occurring, meaning at what level of the supply chain, what tier level, and secondly, how much visibility do companies have into their supply chain, saying or sort of trying to find out if they know who they're dealing with on the tier 1 level, tier 2, tier 3 level. And the outcome of that study really highlighted that more than half of the supply chain disruptions really occurred at a lower tier level, so tier 2 or lower. But at the same time, most organizations actually lack the visibility into the lower tier. Almost 50% know who they're dealing with on a tier 1 level, but if you look further down in the tier 2, that number drops to 21%, and at the tier 3 level, only 2%. Sorry. So since most of the disruptions actually happen at that lower tier level, it really goes to show that just having that visibility into your tier 1 is not enough, because you're being exposed to a lot of risks that you don't know about because you're not sure who you're dealing with. So lacking transparency in your supply chain, if you don't know what's going on with your sub-tier suppliers, you could be exposed to financial risk, you could be exposed to operational risk because you're not getting the supply you need, you could be exposed to reputational risk because some of these suppliers may be involved in activities that you don't want to associate with your company. And once they occur, these disruptions, they will be difficult to control as they ripple through the supply chains and come up the tier level. On average, they're costing companies around the world about 184 million US dollars per year, so it's really a threat to be taken seriously. I want to go back to one slide to just mention two examples that recently happened, which really underlined the lack of visibility in supply chains, especially linked to Ukraine. So on the one hand, Ukraine has become a major hub for cable and wiring components for the automotive industry. And as this is a very labor-intensive process, and companies have been shifting production increasingly eastward, and so the lack of that supply initially in the early weeks after February 24th has really shut down a lot of automotive production lines in Europe. And secondly, there are two Ukrainian companies that are responsible for 50% of global supply of neon, which is an industrial gas used in the semiconductor manufacturing industry. And both of these companies are located within the active sort of war zones. So one is located in Mariupol, one is in Odessa, so very close to that. And both have actually suspended production indefinitely since the outbreak of the war, basically taking 50% of the global supply for neon out of the market. So what can companies really do to make their supply chain more resilient? Well, first, they can ask themselves the right question, starting by, who are your suppliers? What materials do they provide? Where are they located? How many alternative suppliers are there? Are they all located potentially in the same geographic area as the two neon-producing companies that we just heard about in Ukraine that will make them vulnerable to a regional event? Second, companies can also use available network visualization graph technology that identifies key dependencies between suppliers and the flow of goods between them. They do that by analyzing millions of corporate relationships and billions of transactions between them so that they can come up with basically uncovering the sub-tier relationships between suppliers. So once you do use that technology to do a sub-tier analysis and you find out about a potential risk at one of your sub-tier suppliers, well, you have extra visibility. You can monitor these suppliers around the clock, and that will give you a head start before that issue will eventually sort of come up the supply chain and impact your revenue, impact your customer deliveries. In the example I'm showing here, there's basically a disruption at a tier 3 supplier. Ineos, a chemical producing company, at one of their plants in Belgium. And that issue had been identified by the customer 4 months earlier than it would otherwise have been, because it's sort of making its way up to the tier 2, tier 1. And then at one point, somebody is declaring force majeure, and then they find out about it. So they had 4 months to kind of prepare, get alternative supplies in, and in the end, avoid a costly production downtime that would have cost probably millions of euros. So companies should really look at increasing their sub-tier supply chain visibility as driving value, not only in the short term, but really the medium and long term. In the short term, we've heard about it. You know what's going on at your supplier levels. Say they're hit by sanctions, they're have a COVID outbreak, have to shut down the factory. Well, you can increase your compliance efforts on the one hand, but you can also activate contingency measures, right? As we just heard, more quickly by, for example, checking against available inventory, right, in your network, seeing what component supply is disrupted and sort of seeing what available inventory is still there, whether you need to get some more from somewhere else. In the medium term, organizations can also use the enhanced visibility to either increase inventory of critical parts over the medium term or diversify suppliers of critical high-value parts. And that's especially interesting because with that analysis, you can also find out whether, for example, you think you have a diversified supplier base by having 2 or 3 tier 1 suppliers that produce the same thing, but they all depend on the same sub-tier supplier. They all depend on the same tier 2 suppliers. You actually have a bottleneck in your tier 2 level that you don't know about. You think you're diversified, but you're actually not. And thus you create a single source bottleneck that will be very costly in the case of an outage. And in the long term, companies can also consider setting up capital arrangements with critical suppliers, such as the single source one, that may be in financial trouble or not, but you can at least sort of give them, enable them to access capital in case they're struggling and sort of hit by a COVID outbreak or any other financial trouble that would impact their bottom line and sort of increase their resilience, increase your resilience and their innovation over time. So you can really look at this from a medium, short, and long-term perspective. And with these insights, I hope I'm on time. I will wrap it up. Thank you everyone for listening. I will be around as well today and tomorrow, so please approach me if you want to find out more about this. Thank you very much.
Hi. The disadvantage of going last is everybody stole my thunder, so I won't repeat a lot of things that have been said. They make perfect sense, but I will try and relate them a bit to how it affects our logistic supply chain. So the invasion of Ukraine, declining social conditions, the rapid increase in the cost of living, delays, the shortages, they have all exacerbated weaknesses in the logistics supply chain in Europe. And broadly speaking, there is a relationship between cost of living increase and cargo theft, because people who are already under strain will turn to illicit goods or stolen goods to try and make ends meet. So this month in Europe, the Eurozone has reached 8% cost of living. So we can only predict that there's going to be more cargo theft, more smuggling, more trafficking of people, and an increased demand for illicit goods and embargoed goods. So let's turn to a few of the problems as we see them. So I've just listed them all, and I'll go through them, not repeating, hopefully, some of the things. So illicit goods, sanctions resulting in a shortage of luxury goods and everyday goods going to Russia will create a demand that Russian organised crime gangs will meet. Since the 1990s, Russian organised crimes gangs have operated smuggling routes in Western Europe, primarily for the movement of cocaine, heroin, and people smuggling, and on the return trip, stolen and sanctioned goods back into Russia. The northern route in the Baltics is primarily controlled by the Tavbov gang from St. Petersburg, and it's an established smuggling route facilitating the gang's presence in the ports of Riga and Stockholm. Land routes also exist to funnel stolen goods back into Russia through Poland and Latvia, Lithuania, via Belarus. So I think there was a major statement by Moscow in May to say that imported goods, without the intellectual property owners' agreement back into Russia, that the Russian government won't take any sanctions against that. So essentially what they have done is they've said, listen, steal whatever you want, get it back into here, and we're okay with it. So given that we have a Russian organised crime gangs who already have the network established, now we're going to have a demand in Russia. We can absolutely expect crime in Western Europe along those established routes to increase. Another issue is illegal migration. So food prices and the distribution of grain, as we've just heard from Ukraine, is going to give a push factor from Africa into Europe with illegal migration, primarily because there's going to simply be a shortage of grain, and the World Food Organization are already struggling to meet that. So programs that they already have in the third world are going to be under pressure. So we're going to get this push factor of immigration coming into Europe. And with that comes a higher demand then for everyday products. So the BSI, in fact, said that 31% of beverage and 31% of cargo crime is beverages and food products. And as the cost of living goes up, as immigration comes in, we're going to see that area being targeted more extensively. I won't go into fuel crime, as we've spoken about it already, other than it's going to increase. And trucks parking in non-secure parking areas, being siphoned, and even fuel tankers being targeted is going to be a major issue for the logistics supply chain security. Port backlogs as well. I mean, we saw the issue when the shopping habits changed of consumers in Europe and America, and they went more for items coming than services, and it created this backlogs. But embargoed goods and exports to Russia are now increasing the blockage in European ports. 10% of container cargo is Russia-related in Rotterdam, and it has meant that 4,500 containers are awaiting inspection. And that's from mid-February, but the throughput in Rotterdam has gone down by about 2%, and we're only talking about the last 6 weeks of the first quarter. So as long as more embargoed goods, there's going to be increased checks. Increased checks means slower throughput. Slower throughput means a shortage of containers. And we're going to be left with issues like we're having in China with about 500 container ships waiting to unload. So the effect of this is that about 20% of the global containers are on ships awaiting to be offloaded. And that percentage is even higher in the major ports waiting to be distributed. And then we can kick in the issues of driver shortages and infrastructure shortages, etc. Cyber attacks is another issue for Europe, with Antwerp, Amsterdam, and Hamburg all being targeted by cyber attacks. Now, whether these were state-sponsored, whether they were criminal, or whether they were activists, which is another area that we've spoken about, either way, it shows the vulnerability. And when ports have to close down, and the effect of ports close down, coupled with container ships waiting to offload, containers waiting on the dock to be distributed, cyber attacks becomes a real issue in terms of where we're going to go. The European trucking shortage, truck driver shortage also is a huge issue in terms of pre-existing shortages already existed with France, Germany and Spain, according to the Transport Union in 2021, having 135,000 shortage of drivers. The UK alone is estimated at having 100,000 shortages. Demands to improve conditions, improve pay, has put unions in a strong position to argue for their members. Also, how the shortage of truck drivers has knocked on and moved westward across Europe. So with the Ukraine war, we're looking at about 100,000 Ukrainian drivers in Europe that have gone back to fight the war. So males 18 to 60 will fight and go back to fight. Also, the wages of frontline soldiers has gone up, so they'll make a living while they are there. So the shortage of Ukrainian drivers in Poland has caused Poland to pull Polish drivers from Germany, and it's going westward in terms of being able to find drivers. And then it gets back to finding drivers that understand the logistic networks that we have vetted, that understand where to park. So a true flow in your 3PLs and keeping good drivers is an issue. And drivers who are not compliant to security conditions that are laid down by the shippers will only expose them to being stolen. Again, we have the activism, which again is quite big. We've spoken about Spain, we've spoken about the UK, not only from strikes from drivers because of the cost of living, but also eco warriors in terms of imported oil, in terms of stopping product, etc., coming in and going to Russia. So we're only going to have more and more issues. So I call that trends. And trends to me are intelligence. And intelligence lets you see what's coming down the line. But unfortunately, over the last few years, that's even becoming more difficult. There's more and more black swan events, as we would term them. So COVID is definitely a black swan event. The Ukraine war is a black swan event. So it's more difficult for the likes of Michael, who gave the keynote speech there on behalf of Sony, to be able to say, what mode are we going to use? Where are we going to bring our product in? Even some of the questions to him about, would you use this route instead of that route? Would you use this mode instead of that mode? That's what this high-level intelligence is going to give you. But at the end of the day, we're stuck with certain routes, and we're stuck delivering to high population areas. Of course, we'd love to, when we analyse the routes and we see the routes and we see the risk, a lot of logistics companies are still stuck to them. It takes a long time for the likes of the shippers to say, we're going to change from rail out of Russia to ship out of Russia to air out of China, to air out of China. So there's that delay. 3PLs are stuck on certain routes. They have to deliver to the big ports. They have to go to the big ports. They have to deliver to the big population areas. So the second part of intelligence to me is this ability to be able to get real-time intelligence. So there's analytics, there's data, there's this high-level intelligence, and then there's real-time intelligence. So understanding whether your trucking company is compliant with the care that you have asked them. Are they stopping here? Are they stopping there? Does the driver park and not call in, etc.? Whatever levels of security that you have asked them to put in, understanding that in real time, and understanding that there's a protest on the M1, and understanding that this is a really black spot according to all the statistics like Europol, etc., will provide you with. So there's intelligence, there's real-time insights, and then there is a response, because knowing all of that, predicting it, being able to see it in real time, and then what are you going to do? So when we link all these things together, and I think it was probably explained very well by Europol, was that you have to have this response capability, and you have to be able to link these things as a shipper to say, should I change from rail to air? If I do, what route is it going to take? Where is it going to land? What are the statistics telling me? What are the hotspots telling me? And then what's happening in real time? Because we have to remember as well, 99% of everything that moves from A to B gets there. We're talking about the 1%. But the 1%, as Europol said, can be that 2 million load or that 1 million load. So it has a disproportionate impact. So being able to see in real time and being able to get a response. But of course, the problem in Europe, as very eloquently described by Europol, is that we've got 24 languages, we've got so many different jurisdictions. Who reports the crime? Where do you report the crime? Can we get a response within that golden hour? Because as we know, and as was described previously, it will drive around the corner and it will be unloaded. The devices will be smashed or knocked. So everything has to happen in real time. Now at the moment, personally, I don't see all those three elements knitting together in this lovely idea of being able to forecast what's happening, being able to understand what's in Ukraine, being able to put all that to the analytics, the data, the hotspots, and then seeing it in real time and being able to respond. We probably have a bit to go in terms of that, but I think a lot of companies, a lot of good companies are making a lot of efforts in joining that. And the likes of these conversations where we're meeting our peers and we're meeting these fantastic analytics and intelligence companies, and the response element of Europol is pulling all that together. So at risk of repeating everything that was previously said, I think I'll just leave it at there. Okay.
Thank you, Joe. And gentlemen, thank you all three for those very informative and thought-provoking presentations. We've got a couple of minutes for questions, so I'll just ask you all a question. If you just make sure that you speak into your microphones when you answer, that would be fantastic. Steve, let me start with you. Do you foresee more protests taking place across Europe in the foreseeable future?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of probability for that to take place. I mean, fuel prices, as they are, that's just going to encourage more protests. We've seen, Spanish transport sector semi-unorganised. They obviously mobilised quickly. We've seen similar actions in Italy. It's everywhere, and of course, as we discussed, the climate activism has always been there. But I think the Ukrainian conflict has just sharpened that focus and the use of fossil fuels and as we said, Russian imports. So I think activism is definitely going to continue in the medium term, definitely.
Thank you. Mirko, let me come to you now. What would you say are the top security risks that companies really should be having on their minds as we go into the second half of 2022?
Yeah, similar to what Steve said. I mean, activism, definitely, but then also, food-related protests. I think that I mentioned. If we look at maybe not within Europe so much, but maybe on the shores of Europe, if you think about countries that are importing a lot of those grains, those edible oils that are really dependent on that. You see Egypt, Northern Africa, you see Turkey, but even the Middle East, Lebanon. Obviously, if you have food sort of riots there will there's a potential that spills over into Europe. There could be another migrant wave. So definitely there is an increased risk and potential. That's definitely something to watch because, food prices across the many different types of food prices are really at their highest level in 15 years. So it's really a delicate situation, as Joe also said, in terms of the UN getting most of their supplies for their, the World Food Program, getting most of their wheat supplies actually out of Ukraine, and that potentially falling away in the next couple of weeks. There's a high risk there.
Steve, what would you say operators can do to prevent fuel siphoning incidents, which you've talked about, a couple of you have talked about, with so few secure parking areas out there to provide that safe parking that's needed overnight? Sorry. Steve, but I'll come back to you. Joe, I just missed your question, sorry.
So it's for me, Yeah, I think it's that great question. If we're talking trucks, should I secure the fuel tank? If we secure the fuel tank, and I'm sure there's plenty of premium partners who can offer technical and hardening solutions to help with that. But if you secure the fuel tank, you risk then that they will damage the fuel tank and you've lost the fuel and also your truck's off the road waiting for repairs.
But in the absence of secure parking, you know, as a lot of the local police forces are handing out advice, parking in well-lit areas, trying to make it difficult for the criminals to approach the tank, and making it harder for them to steal large quantities. Even pragmatic solutions like if your truck must sit over the weekend, then don't fill the tank up on a Friday, wait until the Monday morning. So if you do experience a loss, then it's potentially less. But I think there's probably other good people in the room that can decide on the pros and cons of securing the tank. But when it comes to your facilities, when you've got thousands of litres, I think you need to take whatever measures you deem fit to avoid that, because if they get in, they could be taking thousands of litres of fuel.
Joe, let me come to you now. Do you believe that high-level analysis, like you were just describing, causes logistics planners to alter their plans?
Yes, absolutely. When we listen to the keynote speaker, Mike Alders, you can see that that type of analysis makes him sit down and go, yes, will I move to air, will I move to... And he's quite... digs in, gets the intelligence and understands. So it absolutely does change. When you bring that further down the line, then how does that affect logistic companies, carriers, etc.? So where product was previously moving along a certain route where we understood what was happening, and because of price or because of geopolitical issues, that has changed. Now we're moving to a route we're putting high-value goods or more goods down it, which mightn't have the capacity, so there's less parking spots. There are maybe less companies that are used to moving that type of high-value product. So the knock-on effect of understanding that high-level intelligence we must also bring that down to the practical level of what does that mean then when we decide to move from road to rail, etc.
Mirko, let me ask you one last question for you. What are the potential scenarios that we can be expecting in Europe going into next winter, given the push towards halting oil and gas from imports from Russia?
Yeah, I mean, there's very many scenarios. Probably the best one would be over the summer, we sort of managed to, fill up all the natural gas tanks or storage areas in Europe, and there will be a mild winter. Worst case will be we don't, on average, so fill it up by sort of 80%, and then there will be a very cold winter, and that will be early on in the winter. So let's say October, because that will then really sort of create fear in the market, and we would really see like these contingency plans that are being drawn up by European governments at the moment to be activated, and that's really like anything between that would be a sort of okay and manageable scenario. But definitely the worst one is that so far you don't really know what to plan with, which obviously is dependent on the weather. And the second is in terms of industrial exposure. No government has come forward with a really practical plan in terms of who are they going to prioritize. It's pretty clear that it's easier to sort of kick out or sort of cut off an industrial customer from a network than sort of, say households. That's much more complicated apparently. But in terms of what industries are going to be prioritized, apart from the essential ones that I mentioned earlier, that's anyone's guess.
Joe, let me give you the last word. Is this kind of analysis actionable intelligence, a term that we hear so much about?
Yeah, I think there's intelligence and then there's actionable intelligence. So actionable intelligence, to me, different people give different definitions, but actionable intelligence to me is understanding that there is that civil disruption on the M1 and you have a truck that is traveling along the M1. Okay, so being able to take a corrective action is actionable intelligence, and being able to link that to your high level. So actionable intelligence really is either preventative or corrective, and or being able to take corrective or preventative actions. And unless you're linking all those together, the system won't work. So there's probably a big issue, or not a big issue, but understanding the terminologies and where they apply is a thing that I think the industry as a whole needs to get to grips with. Yeah.
Well, we are just about to watch a couple of videos, very short ones, so I don't know if you'd like to stay here and watch them on the screens here, or if you want to go back to your seats. But Steve, Mirko, Joe, thank you very much again for such great presentations and for answering those questions. Thank you.